coordinate the library's Arts and Lectures program. And we have a really packed discussion today, and we want to save room for questions. So I'm going to just introduce Bill Poe from the History Department and Barry Preisler from the Political Science Department, and basically just let them do their thing. So thank you all for coming, and just a reminder that next week we'll continue our discussions on the Middle East.
I'm Bill Poe, and I was supposed to be part of the solution. Part of the solution was in 1958 with the creation of the National Defense Education Act. And Title VI of that act was designed to speed up people moving through graduate school in what were called less commonly taught languages. And Arabic was among those. And so I took advantage of that and spent several years of my life studying Arabic, which meant I was supposed to be part of the solution. But my phone has yet to be called by the State Department, and so I'm not a part of the solution. What I want to talk about this afternoon is the way in which we construct what Foucault and Said called imaginary geographies. And we construct an imaginary geography of the Middle East. We construct an imaginary geography of Western civilization. And we construct metaphors for conflict because we have learned that it's all right to fight and die for something that you believe in. So we construct a metaphor for what is believed in. I want to frame the discussion focusing on the Middle East in two areas: oil, probably three areas. Oil is one, oil is two, and nationalism is three. American engineers discovered oil in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi in the 1930s, and that probably has been the single dominating characteristic of the development of American foreign policy in the Middle East since that time. The other thing is the movement toward nationalisms of Arab nationalism and Iranian nationalism. Both of these are movements that are relatively old movements. Arab nationalism certainly goes back into the latter part of the 19th century under the period of the Ottoman Empire. And this particular quotation I find striking by Dulles in the mid-50s, that Arab nationalism isn't something they could be likely to stop, but we could put sandbags around positions we must protect, those being Israel, Lebanon, and the second being oil positions around the Persian Gulf. So we're going to look at these three items: constructing the other, an item that we call Orientalism here, constructing the self, Western civilization, and constructing the ideology of conflict. Orientalism is a term that Edward Said uses to describe the way in which primarily European efforts in literature and art were used to construct a notion of what the Middle East was about. And we can look at that and then look at the way in which Americans have also added to that. Just so you know, there is a parallel. In Arabic, ihtirab could be described as Westernism. So for Arabs who are engaged in things that they think look like Western civilization, there is the parallel concept. Orientalism shows up in French art. The most widely known artist is Ang for this. It depicts Middle Easterners in terms of an imagination of seductive and available women, very light-skinned, as opposed to males who are typically much more dark-skinned. The Orientalism that Said talks about is then added to with our imagination about the Middle East in terms of a series of scholars and explorers beginning perhaps with people like Jean-François Champollion, who is the decipherer of hieroglyphic Egyptian, working with a Rosetta Stone brought to France from Egypt when Napoleon and his army and engineers returned from Egypt. That is its plunder. You also see Champollion here going native, as did Johann Burkhardt, a Swiss-German explorer who learned Arabic almost well enough to pass as a native speaker. So he went in disguise as a Muslim from what became Pakistan, claiming that his native language was Urdu. And if any Arab asked him to say something in Urdu, he'd simply say something in Schweizerdeutsch, knowing that no one that he was talking to understood either language. Burkhardt discovered what had been the fabled lost city of Petra, and also was someone, he went so native that he lived out his life as a professor of Islamic theology at Al-Azhar Mosque University in Cairo, the oldest continuously functioning university in the world. To those explorers and their publications, this is what these people are doing. They're coming back and publishing and talking. We add painters like David Roberts, who, you notice, published 6 volumes of paintings on the Near East. And I must say that his painting of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid is much more dramatic than my photograph of them, creating this image of something that actually transcends the reality itself. Petra was always a popular place for these people to come and paint, and I certainly found it a pleasant place to live and work for a couple of years too. We add to that Agatha Christie, who visited Mesopotamia in the Middle East following a traumatic divorce, went to the site of Ur that was being excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley here, wanted to be shown around, and Woolley was much too busy to show someone around the site, so he assigned the chore to his assistant, Max Mallowan, who, it was love at first sight, and Agatha Christie and Mr. Christie spent a fair amount of time touring the Middle East, and Agatha, of course, wrote stories, including stories seated in Petra. And probably the most famous of these characters at all, helping to create an image of the Middle East, is Sir Richard Francis Burton, the translator of 1,000 Nights and a Night, and also someone who went so native that the British Foreign Office ceased to trust him. That is, you are ceased to trust someone when you're pretty sure they are operating more in the interest of the natives than of the British Foreign Office. Charles Doughty, traveler in disguise through Saudia, visitor to Mecca, writer of books, and one of the people who was a role model for T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, shown here in a formal photograph done several years after the First World War. You add to that the discoveries, financed very often by European and American money. Here, Howard Carter at the tomb of Tutankhamun. Then well publicized after that. The American newspapers and British newspapers were funding much of this work because it sold newspapers to have that. Particularly for what I think of as American Orientalism, the view that we construct, the National Geographic becomes a good source, because if there's anything that's going to portray the way upper middle America looks at things, it's something like this. Beginning in 1914, the National Geographic has a whole series of articles focused on the Middle East. And you notice how academic their interest is here. These are the captions from these photographs. The black bars are bars that I put on there, so not to be guilty of the same degree of exploitation that the Geographic was. You notice their concern with the beautiful tattooing on the chin and the cheeks of the woman there. They're not focused at all upon the fact that her breasts are bare. But contrast that with, in 1930, talking about the excavations at Ur, the men's vitality is remarkable, for after a hard day's work of excavating, they will run home singing and dancing. By nature, they are far from industrious, but under intelligent supervision, they become both keen and efficient. Prosperity came to the ancient Sumerian through his ability to educate and stimulate the native. And there you get the hook that we'll look at in a minute, the hook being the separation of what were beginning to be constructed as the high civilizations of the Near East that become co-opted as foundational to Western civilization from the native that is seen here, that is the Arab that is there as the laborer now. And then in 34, contrast, this is in the next two slides are the same article in the Geographic. You have here the depiction of the Arabs, and particularly you notice that in spite of immigration to the area, every legal safeguard is placed around the rights of the Arabs, longtime sons of the land. That is, they are being portrayed in much the same way that American press will discuss Native Americans. And in the same article, you have, by contrast, the European Jewish settler as the industrious farmer in the area. Geographic continues its particular interest in Middle Eastern women through the 1980s. Although I must say, by the same time, they're also recognizing that women have other roles in society. These are both women in Saudia. In spite of Saudi laws prohibiting women from driving, this woman is a Bedouin, and she's obviously driving. This one I find particularly striking. 1985, the new face of Baghdad. You see it even is marked, Iraq at war. This is the middle of the Iraq-Iran war. Saddam Hussein there. It's pointing out that, the article points out that Baghdad is being remarkably developed at the very same time that Iraq is in this struggle against Iran. A struggle, you understand, that where we were supporting Iraq. We were sending arms, we were sending intelligence. The only two air forces in the world that ever flew F-16s were the US and Iraq. This woman, by the way, is being pointed out as she is the engineer that is directing the construction on this site. Sometimes American Orientalism isn't nearly as subtle, though, as the Geographic. So we look at the second one, constructing Western civilization. World War I, the United States was a reluctant entrant into the war. And as we entered, 500 colleges and universities in the United States had created for them this course that was called the War Issues Course, to be taken by the Students' Army Training Corps. These were students who were about to be soldiers. This is a war of ideas, and this course should give to the members of the Corps some understanding of the view of life and society which they are called upon to defend, and of that view against which we are fighting. That's a kind of timeless kind of statement, you notice. The timeless thing they were trying to reconstruct was this world of the late Roman Empire that became the perceptual foundation for Western civilization, somewhat different than Europe as it had become over a course of several hundred years. And by the time of what people think of as First Europe, that is the period of Charlemagne, in fact, there were three groups around that world. And those very things that very often were treated as the classical foundations of Western civilization were also the foundations of what we call the Byzantine Empire, that called itself Rome, and of the lands dominated by the Muslims. In fact, the Muslims, much more than anyone else, have been responsible for translating and transmitting that same information. And so we created at foundation this kind of image of what the world had looked like. A Western civilization, an Orthodox civilization, and a Muslim civilization. That course was followed by the development of a course called Contemporary Civilization at Columbia. You understand, Western civilization is not a culture. It doesn't fit any anthropological notion what a culture is. Western civilization is a course and it's a reading list. It was created by universities, not by anything else, and it was created in the United States in 1919 and not before. And showed up then at Columbia, and following that, the rise of Western civilization is in fact the rise of what has been the bread and butter of university teaching for most of the 20th century. And I'll remark on the side that to my knowledge there has never been a Western Civ course taught at Sonoma State. Since the foundation, we taught a course that was called Foundations of World Civilization, never a Western civilization course. You then have to construct the ideology of the conflict in which we're engaged now. Samuel Huntington in 1993 in Foreign Affairs published an article called Clash of Civilizations. When it was published as an article, it had a question mark at the end. When it was redone as a book, it lost the question mark somehow. This article generated more letters than any other had ever done in Foreign Affairs, and he picked up on this notion of Western civilization, reconstructed it somewhat, constructed something that almost every area expert that looked at it said is the most ridiculous thing we'd ever seen. This article was severely trashed by anyone who knew anything about the field of study. The very idea that all of Africa south of the Sahara is a single civilization. The idea that all of Latin America, with the exception of 3 countries that don't speak Spanish, is a central civilization. The idea that somehow you have civilizations split on opposite sides of China is a little bit ridiculous. But this doctrine of what civilizations look like became the Bible of the development of neoconservative thought about foreign policy. And so based on that, you then have the articulation of the ideology of conflict. Here from George Bush, these kinds of statements. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion. Or, the great challenge to this century is this: young democracies flourish and terrorists try to stop their progress. On the other side, you have the use of these terms, Islamo-fascist or terrorists. These are the words that are there in Arabic, mujahideen in the plural and mujahid in the singular. These very words that they use of themselves, when Osama bin Laden was fighting the Russians in Afghanistan, the term that was used to translate mujahideen was freedom fighters. Now the word used to translate it is jihadists, or Islamic radicals. Bin Laden himself laid out in 1998 the basis for his opposition to the West in a frontline interview. The call to wage war against America was made because America spearheaded the crusade against the Islamic nation, sending tens of thousands of its troops to the land of the 2 holy mosques, over and above its meddling in the affairs and the politics. That is, at the time, the United States had occupying forces in the northern part of Saudi Arabia, part of the fallout from the first Gulf War. That was the main reason there. It's not hating our freedoms, it's American forces stationed in the Middle East. Now this, you notice I haven't given you the citation yet. This is the one I think most striking. What we ought to consider in earnest today is the emergence of a world culture. World culture cannot and ought not to ignore characteristics and peculiarities of any particular local culture with the aim of imposing its own upon them. Cultures and civilizations that have naturally evolved among various nations in the course of history are constituted from elements that have gradually adapted to collective souls and to the historical and traditional characteristics. As such, these elements merge with each other and consolidate within an appropriate network of relationships. In spite of plurality and diversity, a unique form can be abstracted. In order for the world culture to assume a unified identity in form and substance, and avoid the chaos caused by various cultural discords, it must engage all the concerned parties in dialogues aimed at exchanging knowledge, experience, and raising understanding of diverse ideas of culture and civilization. Does that make sense? Mohammed Khatami said that. Former president of Iran. So it's a matter of perspective. Thank you. You want a map?
Great. That helps. Thanks a lot, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have a microphone here? Hi, folks. I think Bill has given you more than enough to ponder and think about and reflect upon. Almost all that information he presented to you, I think, is probably news to most of you, and indeed intriguing ideas and giving a context to history. If that was a very broad brushstroke of not only the Middle East, but our perspectives of the Middle East, I'm going to hit you with something that's very, very specific, and that is a discussion about the war that went on in the Middle East last summer. But I have, of all the buttons that Bill pushed and got me started thinking, it just hit me in that National Geographic piece. You see that one Iraqi woman engineer, contractor engineer on site. Was she just a showpiece indication of the modern Iraq, and do the Iraqi universities have engineering departments that look like American universities, overwhelmingly male? At least under Saddam, it was rather famous that the engineering departments, the mechanical and electrical and all the other engineering departments were about 50-50, men versus women, all the way up to the last day that Saddam was in power in Iraq. I don't know if I could say that about present times. As my little side note, my daughter yesterday interviewed for a postdoc position at the UCLA Electrical Engineering Department, and every single face in the audience that she faced was male. So if she ever gets there, she might be the showpiece woman in an otherwise overwhelmingly male-dominated university. Again, not who's modernizing and how fast. To give one little cap to Bill's comments. So switching very dramatically, what I'd like to talk about is what consumed me this last summer. I do teach Middle East politics. I have been following Middle Eastern politics for most of my adult life. And perhaps the most astounding event that I have observed, at least the most astounding military outcome that I have observed over the last 30, 40 years, happened this last summer. My guess is that if you've tried to follow this, try to follow it in the American media, you either are clueless about how astounding this was, or it's maybe not your fault, they just get lost in details, or they just get lost in general. But even if you're paying minimal attention, you might have been better off. You might have picked up some basic facts that simply didn't sound right to you. Indeed, sounded unbelievable. A group that I don't have to introduce, I think you know the name. It's been around for years, but most of the time you do have to have it introduced. The Hezbollah Forces, the group that is concentrated in southern Lebanon, mainly Lebanese Shia Muslims of southern Lebanon. That's one of the many groups, but one of the main groups, ethnic religious groups of southern Lebanon. The Hezbollah Forces in Lebanon, after 2 days of fighting against the Israelis, after 2 weeks of fighting against the Israelis, after 5 weeks of battle with the Israelis, were still firing rockets into Israel. The Israeli armed forces, for all their apparent overwhelming military superiority, were unable to stop these rocket attacks. The Israeli army, perhaps for the first time, was unable to protect Israeli soil. They were unable to protect Israeli civilians deep inside their country from being attacked. That should sound strange, not just unusual, but almost inconceivable. Similarly, but even more astoundingly, Hezbollah forces in Lebanon were engaging the Israeli military forces when the Israelis finally turned and went to the invasion stage of the battle about 2 weeks after the first hostilities. Hezbollah forces in Lebanon were engaging Israeli tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and all the rest in southern Lebanon and knocking out Israeli tanks or disabling Israeli tanks. And most of those tanks that were lost by the Israelis this last summer were the Israeli Merkava class tanks, among the most advanced and best armored in the world. And what the Hezbollah forces were knocking them out with were obviously like handheld kind of bazooka missiles. This is not a new phenomenon that the Israelis were unaware of. The 1973 war hinged on exactly that kind of battle. Some of you may know that the battle in the Sinai Desert between Egyptian forces and Israeli forces was the second largest tank battle in history. The Israelis lost thousands of tanks, the Egyptians lost thousands of tanks, but what was knocking out Israeli tanks at that time were these sort of handheld bazooka-like missiles that could be, if you could keep the individual soldier standing on his feet, focused on the final target without getting shot, without getting killed, and held it long enough, it could knock out a tank in those days. The Israeli tanks, the Merkava tanks, are 2 generations after that. It's not supposed to happen again. We have double armor and all the rest of it that is supposed to keep that from ever happening again. Somehow it was happening again, and Israeli tanks were being knocked out by Hezbollah. Now, it would seem gratuitous to say this, but since, as far as I could tell, almost no one seems to have said it, this should never have happened. It was inconceivable that individual Hezbollah fighters could knock out Israeli tanks. It was inconceivable that any fighters launching missiles into Israel from southern Lebanon would not be knocked out quickly. Inconceivable. They're stored weapons. They would be found within a few days at most. They would be destroyed or discovered. It shouldn't have happened. It couldn't possibly have happened that way, but that's exactly what did happen. And let me elaborate, even though I don't have much time, on what should be obvious about this. And I use this term that doesn't capture how different these military forces are. When I use the term Israel's conventional military superiority, this is almost a joke. Our language isn't good enough to indicate how uneven this battle was in conventional military hardware. Hezbollah has no aircraft, it has no bombers, no fighter jets, it has no tanks of its own, it has no cannons of its own, it has no navy, it has no helicopter warships. Israel has all of these, indeed, some of the most advanced in the world, and yet for all this, Israel could not defeat Hezbollah. They could not stop those rockets from being launched from Lebanon into northern Israel from the first day of the battle to the last, in which at least dozens of Israeli civilians are killed and over 100 Israeli soldiers are killed, and bringing the Israeli economy to a standstill. Let me look for you, or look with you, more closely at how and where and why the Israelis lost their soldiers. It highlights this unbelievable outcome even more astoundingly in this battle of last summer. The Israeli army began their ground invasion of southern Lebanon within 2 weeks of the beginning of the conflict. They were bombing into Lebanon, and into the Beirut area and different targets in Lebanon from the air, and firing tank shots from Israel. But about 2 weeks into the battle, the Israeli army moved into South Lebanon. They began their invasion at that time. We heard their reports of moving 10 or 20 or 30 miles into Lebanon. But after that penetration, most of the battles in which the Israelis lost soldiers, people died, their soldiers died or were injured, were in the areas closest to the border with Israel, that is, within a few miles of Israel. Most of their casualties took place behind their supposed front lines, behind the areas that the Israeli army had supposedly secured. And what was obvious from that is the Israelis had been able to secure nothing. Now, any invading army has to deal with the possibility of isolated pockets of resistance, But these were not isolated pockets of resistance you mop up, to use one of these euphemistic phrases that are used in war. You mop up isolated pockets of resistance within a few days in any invasion. But these battles continued to happen until the final ceasefire finally took place. That was the only thing that stopped those missiles from being fired into Israel. Indeed, in the last days of fighting, after the UN ceasefire resolution, which was on Friday, August 11th, but before the actual ceasefire was to take place on Monday the 14th. So one more weekend of, we know the ceasefire is coming, but there is still, you're not breaking the ceasefire if you still continue to shoot. During that weekend, the Israelis put on a huge last offensive. If you can think of the logic there from the Israeli perspective, you're going on an offensive when you know you will be pulling out on Monday, you're going to go on another offensive on Saturday. Put that aside, hoping against hope that Hezbollah's agreement to the ceasefire signaled their weakness rather than Israel's own. In that weekend, 30 more Israelis died, most all of them soldiers, some civilians, and the Hezbollah fired 250 missiles into Israel on that Sunday, which is the most of any day in the fighting. They were not running out of steam. What does all this mean for Israel? What does it mean for the United States, Israel's major supporter and backer? What does it mean for the future of the Middle East? Again, the Bland reports it might give heart to those who are not fans of America. For those who have considered America and Israel to be their enemies in the Middle East, again, using the term it gives them heart is understating it rather dramatically. I have to come up with a footnote here to discuss something which was used or was brought up in terms of the arguments about what was going on at that time, to discuss them. And that is the idea that Israel was holding back, trying to save Lebanese lives, while Hezbollah was what? Hiding behind civilians. There's at least 2 or 3 points here, if you can bear with me. It doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about, this military dominance that should have been there. The Israelis should have achieved unquestionably a military victory in a short time. And the idea that they're holding back. First, if the Israelis are claiming that they knew Hezbollah fighters were firing from mosques, from schools, from hospitals, or whatever, and that then their missiles were killing Israeli civilians deep inside Israel, and that what? The Israeli commanders didn't hit back when they saw these missiles being launched from civilian targets because what? They feared killing Lebanese civilians. I'm sorry, that is unbelievable. I don't believe that. I don't buy it. If I was an Israeli, I would shoot such an officer. If you know where they're shooting from, you fire into them. You use the argument that they're hiding behind civilians precisely because you will be hitting civilian targets and you will be killing civilians, and you want to be able to blame the other side. Yes, indeed, we're killing civilians, but it's because they're hiding among civilians. That one makes sense, and if you're sympathetic with Israel, you buy that. But it has nothing to do with holding back when there are missiles being fired. If the Israelis could find out where those missiles are coming from and somehow knock them out, whether they're among civilians or not, they would have fired and knocked them out. Much more importantly, about what we know, again, this is from mainly Israeli sources, the Israeli army in South Lebanon. After the Israeli army had invaded and after they began their ground operation, Hezbollah fighters abandoned all the towns and villages in the face of this advance in the south. Israeli forces basically went into every town and village without opposition. Hezbollah defended none of those towns, sort of a classic guerrilla strategy. You do not defend territory. Indeed, the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, told the Israelis exactly what he would do. They would not defend any towns, and indeed they took them over. But most, if not all, of the missiles that continued to hit into Israel came from these southern regions. And essentially all of the battles with Israeli tanks that took place when the Israelis tried to move out of these villages into the countryside around the villages, it is there in that situation that they lost most of their soldiers, most of their tanks, when they tried to move out into the countryside. The typical metaphor used by Israeli soldiers was, we would run into a hornet's nest of missiles and fire as soon as we stepped out of villages, as soon as we stepped out into the countryside. And again, the missiles coming from the countryside, they were not coming from civilian concentrations, precisely outside of civilian concentration. Third point here is if we simply ignore the UN condemnation of Israel's attack on civilians, if we ignore Human Rights Watch and their condemnation, their human rights violations, the hitting of civilian targets, if we ignore Amnesty International coming out and saying they are intentionally targeting civilians, indeed when there are no Hezbollah fighters, if we ignore all that, all we can say at the end of the day is that the Israeli military forces have come up with an unbelievable and gigantic military failure because the only people they were able to kill in Lebanon were civilians. Almost no confirmed hits. Just if we take Israel's count of what they think they killed, it only adds up to about 100 Hezbollah warriors. They did kill over 1,000 Lebanese, 1,100 Lebanese by the Lebanese government's count. But in terms of those battles that went on in the south, and the Israeli soldiers, I think we killed someone, there's a body there. As far as they could confirm, less than 100 warriors killed, whereas 1,000 civilians were killed. You might compare that with the civilian versus military casualties that Israel suffered. With all those missiles fired into northern Israel, especially the Haifa area, by Hezbollah, the Israeli civilian death toll is in the range of about 30 people, and the Israeli military losses were in the range of 120 military personnel that were killed by Hezbollah. In other words, whatever they were aiming at, they were killing soldiers. Whatever Israel might have been aiming at or claiming to aim at, what they ended up killing were civilians. Now, I hope I've described it in dramatic enough terms. That shouldn't have happened. It has implications for American policy. It has implications for Israel's future. Very, very briefly, I'm going to give you a rundown, a 3-hour lecture on international relations. And the idea that calls itself political realism, perhaps the most famous, the most popular. They're political realists since the time of the Greeks. Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War, gave us our first lesson in political realism. Is more or less a policy of how does a country, how do you use military force to maintain your country's security? How do you keep your country from being destroyed? How do you keep your nation from being overwhelmed? How do you use military force? And there's sort of two questions. One is, you have enough military means to fend off any attack. That's fairly straightforward. Have a bigger army than anybody that might attack you. But much more importantly, in the use of military force, how do you use military force in a way so that you deter future attacks? Much, much more difficult. And if anything, this theory wasn't written for Israel, but it seems to be entirely appropriate to the history of Israel. Israel, through much of its history, has had not just to win wars, that's not good enough. It wants to deter wars. It is a relatively small country in terms of population. At many times in its history, it has been potentially facing all of its neighbors, all of its Arab neighbors in battle. In the 1967 war, almost all of its neighbors were at war with Israel. And you want not just to defeat them, you must be so good in your use of force in defeating them that you deter them from ever thinking of going to war against you in the future. In that context, the 1967 war, where Israel faced and defeated Syria and Egypt and Jordan and others that were giving aid to those basic frontline countries, it was perhaps one of the most astounding military victories in history, a one-sided victory, an overwhelming one-sided victory of Israeli forces over Arab government forces. That's the kind of victory you want, not just a victory. You can't just win to a draw. You can't win by a decision of the judges, 5-4, not good enough. You have to deter future attacks. And even though you could call, in some objective sense, what happened in Lebanon this last summer a draw, Israel did not achieve its military goals. It did not achieve its stated military or political goals. It had to retreat. This is devastating to that kind of ability to deter attacks. someone stood up to Israel and held them off. And it's not even an even battle. It's not even a country with almost the same kind of military capabilities as Israel. Of course, it is somebody that has nothing of what Israel has in terms of its military capability. To engage in military, the use of force, and to want to hang on to this ability to deter future attacks, which is fundamental to Israel, and I would argue it's fundamental to American policies around the world and in the Middle East, to get started on a war that perhaps was ill-conceived, much more better conceived by the Israelis. Of course, they were attacked first, or they could call it the abduction of Israeli soldiers an attack. But to get involved in a war and the use of your force and not win when you're supposed to win, and to be driven in a kind of war of attrition into just having to give up, that is simply devastating for your credibility, for your prestige. It should ring somewhat familiar for someone else that got into an ill-conceived war, as if it wasn't quite clear before you got started. Everybody that wasn't a fan of Samuel Huntington in Washington, D.C., colleagues of mine all saying, look, you get to war in Iraq and it will be worse. We will make things worse for ourselves on the most fundamental of issues, on the recruitment of terrorists that want to give up their lives attacking anything American or anything Western. It will be worse for us. It seems to be now the consensus of our generals, of our intelligence community, and almost everybody that's speaking out in Washington, D.C., as if we have discovered it after the fact. But I got news for you. It was predicted before the fact by almost everybody that wasn't there in that White House decision-making group that was ignoring all of this other input. Israelism, it's not just that Israel should have defeated Hezbollah. Israel, in the first day, indicated what their real security threat was. Who's behind this? They said it out loud. You say this out loud and it changes everything for this war. It is not just a war between you and a group in southern Lebanon. They said Syria and Iran are behind this. Israel's security will only be achieved when we deal with what is behind this challenge to Israel. To make those statements, put your prestige and your credibility on the line, and if you cannot defeat Hezbollah, of course, what the Israelis, I'm sure, were thinking is going to be easy. I thought it was going to be easy, and I thought the next attack would be a contrived attack against Syria. And you may have heard that some people are thinking of finding an excuse to attack Iran. This may have been what at least some in the Israeli administration, not everybody, but some in the Bush administration thought was the opening to proceed forward with an attack against Iran and with Syria. And indeed, our world has been turned upside down by those events. I'm going to have to stop. But that's at least, if you thought, shouldn't somebody be saying something more about what has gone on? Isn't something really fundamental been changed? And what does it mean for American policy? It just doesn't seem to bode well for at least the Bush style of policy. But I'll leave it open to questions. Thank you.
We have time for questions for both our speakers.
Yeah. Karen.
So, your last statement, what do you think has fundamentally changed?
I think it's a compounding effect. To be in Iraq, to state your goals in Iraq, to be the creation of anything, but to use military force, we went in, we indeed defeated Saddam's army, but now we are being worn down. It is exactly what some people predict. Look, you can defeat Saddam's army, maybe easily, but that won't mean the Iraqis will submit to a foreign domination. They just don't believe you when you're saying you have good intentions. They've had too many people conquering them, all saying we're here to liberate you. They know their history even if we don't. And therefore, what the implications of all this are I'm not sure how much worse it can get. We have dug ourselves a hole. There's no nice way to get out of it. To leave Iraq, it's going to be a disaster for our credibility. For the Israelis, the Israelis really don't have any alternative. Those political realists have only one response. It's very easy to be a political so-called realist. You should have bombed more. You didn't bomb enough. You devastated most of Beirut. You didn't bomb enough. America haven't used enough forces, haven't used enough violence, and since we don't have any more forces, I guess we should bomb more, we should use more military force. That's about the only thing you're going to hear from them. But the reality is we are at the end of our use of military force. If we think we can just bomb a few places in Iran and not have all hell break loose, we are truly kidding ourselves. If we don't do something, if we don't achieve any of our goals, well, we've been led down a path that was quite predictable, a disaster for American interests. But arguably, if we really want to deal with the problem of terrorism, I would say the sooner we get out of that, the better. It won't get better, it will get worse, so the sooner we get out, the better. Okay?
We have a lot of experience with this. You know, you do remember that in Vietnam, the United States dropped more tonnage on Hanoi than it dropped on Germany, and we lost. So conventional means don't necessarily work at all for that. If you can't engage at the level at which Hezbollah has engaged, and you can't engage at the level that is being engaged at in Iraq now, then all you can do is wait till you're thrown out.
Yes?
It seems to me that both of you in different ways talked about sort of images over and against reality. I mean, it struck me when you were talking about credibility that one way to think about that is that's really about constructing a way that you want other people to view you, right? I mean, and your talk, most of it was really focused on that. So I wonder if either of you have any comments you want to make about what kinds of metaphors. I mean, obviously, Orientalism isn't really working. For instance, what you're suggesting is that the images that are being framed here aren't working. What kinds of images or metaphors would be a different way to proceed? Like, how do we model? I know that's kind of hard to answer, but I mean, if we're talking about the way we represent global relations, and Bill, you talked about this sort of unified culture. I actually don't buy that. I actually think it doesn't make sense to me. This is too abstract. But again, that's an image. Is there anyone that you've heard or read that you feel like does a better job of representing? If we're talking about representations here, that does a better job of representing these conflicts?
I think a model of political.
Is there? If I can repeat the question, are there any other metaphors, any other images that are better than the Orientalist version that might help us better? Image versus reality. Is there any other better images?
I think the image that emerged during the Hellenistic period, and at its best was being used also by the Ottoman Turks, is an image that backs completely away from some kind of notion of nationalism and national identity as a construct, and focuses cultural identity on much smaller units and recognizes that within the overall political unit, there's a great deal of diversity that can be recognized, but that minimizes the degree of, that eliminates what we might call patriotism completely. It means you do not have a strong identity at the highest level of the socioeconomic spectrum. You back away from that for much more local kinds of issues. I think that's a metaphor that works much better than nationalism does as a metaphor.
Can I disagree immediately with the question? I think we shouldn't even be doing any metaphors. I would much rather everybody sees the reality of who the people are and what we have done there. I think our biggest problem as Americans, we simply don't know what American policies are. We don't know what we are, how we are judged. If I can make any quick reading recommendations, this is a book I use in almost every one of my courses called The Stakes by Shibli Telhami. Professor at the University of Maryland College Park, and he talks about how we are judged. It has to do with our policies. Do they disagree with our freedoms, with our values? No. He went out and found a public opinion gauging agency that has never been allowed to work in places like Saudi Arabia. They got public opinion. Do they disagree with our values? They like our values. They like democracy. They like freedom. What they disagree with, what they are profoundly opposed to, is the reality of our policies. In particular, our policies in regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How the Israelis treat the Palestinians, how they have gone through this so-called peace process, what we consider to be our good faith intervention in that, or lack of intervention in that, versus the reality of what we have done, that's how we are judged. And to the degree we pay attention to that and recognize that's you know how Osama bin Laden recruits his members, his terrorists, not by quotations from the Quran. He shows pictures of people dying in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli occupation. And oh, by the way, now he's got extra film to show of what has gone on in Iraq under American occupation in Iraq. Maybe he doesn't even have to go far. He can't, you know, the pictures of Abu Ghraib. Do you think he can recruit less people or more people, given what Americans have actually done in the Middle East and what we have supported? So the reality of what we're doing, we're the ones that need to open our eyes and look beyond any metaphors. It's an extraordinary place. I spent 3 years living in the Middle East, the most hospitable, most incredibly friendly and hospitable people I've ever met in my life are Middle Eastern Arabs, in particular Palestinians, and Iranians and Afghanis. And why is my image so different? I'm not, at that time when I was there, you know, I don't agree with American policy. Oh, you don't? You actually know what they've done? Yes, I do. And all of a sudden, I am a friend rather than an enemy. It's really not that hard for as individuals, although it's that much more difficult for anybody to think of traveling in the Middle East today. No. No.
About the war in Lebanon, recently I've been following some news. There have been murmurs of the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, trying to restart negotiations with Israel. It seems like that he must feel like it's a political opportunity, but Israel is once again saying no. I would like for you to talk about that and Syrian involvement in Lebanon, because it just withdrew like a year before the war started.
Let me throw my 2 cents out here. There was, in terms of Syria being behind Hezbollah, undoubtedly, and Syria's perhaps intention to reopen negotiations. Footnote, Israel occupies Syrian land, not just Palestinian or Jordanian land, but Syrian land, the Golan Heights. And they have since 1967. In the late 1990s, it looked like there might be a negotiated peace settlement between Syria and Israel. And the way we heard it here, oh, Syria turns down a good offer. And the good offer was one in which Israel would keep some of the Golan. You get to keep some of that Golan, you get some of that Golan Heights back, that territory, but some of it you don't get back. And Syria simply would not agree to giving up any of its territory. All of it belonged to Syria. It was conquered by use of force, and they wanted all of it back. Now, at the time, we blamed Syria for not accepting a good deal. But let's look at it in retrospect. I'm going to throw this one out. I know most people will not think this is a viable option. But if Israel had negotiated a peace treaty and given all of the Golan Heights back and had a full-scale diplomatic relations with Syria, which would have been the outcome of that, I can almost guarantee you there would have been no war in Lebanon last summer. This was not part of the political discourse. We missed our chance for peace when we could have bargained from a position of strength. The peace process wasn't just an advantage to Syria. The peace process between Israel and the Palestinians was not just for the advantage of the Palestinians. It was to the degree that most Israelis didn't recognize at the time, the collapse of the peace process was just as much a disaster for Israel. But since they retained control of lands and they can continue to have more settlers going and living in the West Bank, they thought they were at an advantage. We've gone through the peace process. We can blame the Palestinians for its collapse, and we will take advantage from that. No. I think they blew their chance. I think none of this would have happened if those peace treaties, and they were very close to concluding peace treaties at that time. This is completely outside of what most discourse is going to be like. The discourse will be, we didn't bomb enough, we didn't supply our soldiers in South Lebanon, not enough water bottles. That's where the Israeli army was checked. I mean, a lot of nonsense. Or the Israeli commander-in-chief of the invasion forces was too busy selling off his stock portfolio the day of the battle started to try to save money for himself. All of these are side issues. Maybe the lost chance for peace was what the real disaster was, not You were not ready. It's not that you weren't ready for war. It was that you perhaps were not ready for peace. They don't ask that question. I wish they would. I think there lies the answer to Israel's security, and guess what? I think ours as well. Jennifer?
What would you say about religious ideas in the midst of all the politics, when people argue that it doesn't matter about the United States foreign policy or Israel's politics if there is a religious idealism behind, if you're not a Muslim and you are a Muslim, and ideas about who should live based on religious ideals? Do you think it's just propaganda, or do you think that doesn't exist as a reason for why fighting's going on, and what the real big picture is from up above?
All of the above, because all three of the religions involved have got a huge spectrum of expressions, and all of them have people involved in the conflict who are secular as well, and only nominal members of the religion. It's certainly the case that bin Laden, being a Wahhabi Muslim, is an extremely conservative Muslim, and in the statement I had up where he's particularly offended by the American forces being in Saudi Arabia, because Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, but Arabia, the peninsula, has always been, since the advent of Islam, it has been the one place in the world dominated by Muslim forces where non-Muslims were not permitted to live. The peninsula itself is sacred in a way the rest of the dominated world isn't. So for bin Laden, not necessarily for all Muslims, but for bin Laden and for the Wahhabi movement, it is particularly offensive that there be American forces in Arabia, more so than American forces elsewhere. But at the same time, there's also a notion within Islam, going back to early days of the expansion, that once a territory becomes Muslim territory, then you can never give it up. So to be occupied. But there are also secular forces that would pay no attention to that and still find it offensive. I didn't show one of the maps that I have here. There are American forces in almost all of the countries around Iran at this point. So it's not just that they're one place. The United States is occupying a huge amount of the Middle East. So there are religious objections to that, but there are also strong secular objections to it as well.
Probably have to end it, but if I can give you a quick answer, I don't think it's mainly religion. It's obviously a factor. When many people do these things, they're reciting the Quran. But I think we've had the problem of antagonism to America and American policies long before Islam became a renewed political force in the Middle East. Some of you are old enough to remember the Iranian Revolution. That shocked everybody. Islam as a political force, everybody thought Islam was a dead political force. The force we were up against that Bill made quick reference to was nationalism, which brought people together whatever their religion. The original versions of Palestinian terrorism were carried out by Palestinian groups who were famous for their identity as Palestinians, whether they were Muslim or Christians. Some of the most famous hijacking events of the 1970s were carried out by a group that was almost entirely Palestinian Christians. So they're doing those things, but it's not Islam. We're having the same problems over and over again. Indeed, the face is much more Islam today than it was then. But you might say, wait a minute, we've got the same problems with a different face. Maybe it's not the face that is the issue, but what's going on behind that face. Let me just toss out to you another alternative vision, a correlation. From 1993 to 2000, from the time that the Israelis and Palestinians at least appeared to be engaging in a peace process, and the United States, instead of standing in the way of peace, seemed to be brokering and nurturing along a peace process between Palestinians and Israelis. For all its flaws, from 1993 to 2000, the number of terrorist acts against American targets in the world originating from Middle Eastern sources went down every single year. When it looked like America was at least somewhat honestly engaged in trying to produce peace, and indeed one that dealt with the Palestinian issue, we had less and less to worry about in terms of terrorism. When that peace process that we call the peace process broke down in 2000. The next thing you know, Palestinians are again being fired upon, almost a free fire zone in the West Bank and Gaza, and you have, boom, we have a gigantic terrorist attack against us. It is a correlation. Correlation is not causation, but I think that's a correlation that might lead to a different kind of policy. On July 10th, instead of saying what we have to do here in this imminent situation is negotiate peace, make sure this doesn't get out of hand, that let's try to avoid war or keep war from getting out of hand. No, we didn't hear one word of that from the American administration or the American press. It was, Israel has been wrong, Israel has a right to self-defense, unchecked, unqualified support for war by one side. Not, we should try to negotiate an end to this conflict before it gets out of hand. So we have not stood for peace for a hell of a long time. And indeed, that is recognized in the Middle East. I think if we made genuine peace efforts instead of, the Bush administration is just famous for not doing anything. Clinton, not very good, but the Bush administration just has left it completely undone. And I think that's another interpretation of the problems we have. Again, it's a distinctive interpretation. But worth a try. I think we got to go, but maybe a quick question in the back?
Do you believe that this incident that united the conflict in Israel and Lebanon recently was a rash individual action that then had to be answered on a larger, the avalanche to be answered on a larger scale? Or do you believe that it was a corporate action by Hezbollah to achieve a certain effect? Do you believe they achieved that?
Certainly on July 10th or 11th, here's a group with, 3,000 or 4,000 fighters that couldn't seem to match up against anything in the world, much less the Israeli military. You wouldn't say that's a rational act. Is Israel going to sit still and just take this? Of course not. It doesn't look like an irrational act. I know what you're talking about. On the other hand, the Middle East is full of these irrational acts that you shouldn't be starting something. You are going up against somebody who's militarily much stronger, but that keeps on happening. Now you can say, oh, it's their religion, it's their worldview, their civilization, or you can say this is the act of desperation of people who are trying to deal with an unacceptable reality, and indeed it might be connected to other events, as I think almost all of them are connected to other events, what was going on in the West Bank and Gaza in that time period, what America was doing, what Israel was doing, and bingo, an explosion, otherwise irrational act blows up in our faces. We don't know where that's come from. I think it keeps on happening. Indeed, an act of terror, killing yourself, that's an irrational act. Don't you have something, if you have bombers, you do something different. You don't. And what are you going to achieve with that act? You're not going to defeat anybody militarily, but maybe that's the act of desperation. Indeed, terror is the weapon of the weak.
Thank you.